MPhil in Islamic Studies at the University of Cambridge and is currently a PhD candidate at the Faculty of Divinity, University of Cambridge, where the focus of his research is aesthetics in Ibn Arabi. His research interests are quite varied and include anthropology, specifically anthropology of art, the Platonic tradition and antiquity, Renaissance Platonism, German Romanticism and Heidegger, Islamic mystical thought, particularly Surawardi and Ibn Arabi, comparative religion and mysticism, and comparative aesthetics. I hope you're as excited as I am to hear about what Mr. Mahmoud has to say during his presentation of Color, Symbolism, and the Mystic Quest, the spiritual exegesis of color and Sufism in the works of Henry Corbin. Enjoy.
Thank you very much. While working on this paper, I decided to change the title from the title that was that's announced in the booklet to a more modest title called Reflections on Henry Corbin's Study of Color and Sufism. And the reason why I did that is because I found that before I can actually get into the Sufi literature on color, a lot has to be introduced about Corbin himself and the particular approach of the Sufis to the phenomenon of color. Henry Corbin is well known as being one of the greatest scholars on Sufism in the 20th century. He's a scholar in Islam, a student of Massignon. He wrote hundreds of works, but the ones I want to focus on here two papers or two works on color. The first is a book-length work titled The Man of Light in Iranian Sufism, in which he analyzes the symbolism of color and light in the works of Suhrawardi, Najmuddin Kubra, Samnani, and many others. And the second is an Eranos lecture given in 1972 on the general theme of color, especially realism and symbolism of color in Kermani. Now, unfortunately, Corbin's work on color has been neglected in the study of neglected entirely in the study of Islamic civilization, but particularly neglected by art historians who are most concerned with color and Islamic civilization, simply because Corbin's theories on color and his study of Sufism seem to be too far-fetched and mystical to be of any help in understanding Islamic art or architecture. Now, why invoke Henry Corbin in a conference on color in the first place? And what bearing does Sufism have on Islamic art and architecture? These are very difficult questions, and I won't get into this very difficult debate. Well, what I want to do is take advantage of the title of this conference and the diverse other hues, color in Islamic art and culture, and introduce a broad approach to the study of culture, or arts, particularly in the works of Sufis. But particular significance of Corbin for me is that he was able to present for a modern audience and in the language of contemporary philosophy, very difficult language and cosmology, an approach to phenomena and the mystical experience that we find in the Sufis. Any reader who picks up any Sufi work will find that the work is very difficult to understand and very inaccessible. And Corbin's value, for me at least, in relation to color, is his ability to translate, act as a cultural translator and mediator of these very difficult concepts and ideas. So I've chosen a number of themes in Corbin's own work to focus on. And having understood these themes, I think one can be able to manage a reading of, or enter the world of the Sufi, as it were. The first theme, very important theme, I think, is the question of approach towards a phenomenology of color. How does one actually approach the phenomenon of color? We take for granted the colors that we see around us, but the way we see the world is fundamentally different from the way that the Sufis saw the world. Jonathan Bloom, in his presentation earlier, gave a very brief glimpse of a scientific approach to the study of color, in which one can say that the distinction between different colors from scientific point of view, and I'm oversimplifying here, but just for the purpose of argument, in the sense that colors are distinguished between the different light vibrations, light wave vibrations. And it's kind of a quantitative approach to the study of color, which starkly contrasts with what I'm about to present shortly. But I want to give a very quick presentation of this quantitative approach, because this method is less scientist to distinguish between primary and secondary qualities of objects. Primary qualities being those that can be expressed mathematically, such as number, magnitude, position, motion, and shape. But all those other qualities that can't be expressed in this mathematical formula, like color, taste, and sound, are considered secondary, i.e. not very essential for the understanding of the actual phenomenon itself. At best, when these secondary phenomena are explained, they're explained in terms of primary phenomenon. So color is explained in terms of the primary phenomenon of light wave vibrations, rather than explaining color as we experience it and as it presents itself. Emotional responses, existential moods, inner movements of the soul that result from the act of perceiving a color, which is what artists and poets are constantly preoccupied with. All those features of the perception of nature which are most immediately experienced and are judged to be unreal or mere illusions of the senses. They're subjective responses that have no bearing on the phenomenon under observation and therefore are rejected or at best ignored. So by quantifying the phenomenon of color into measurable light wave vibrations, all those subjective elements that hinder the objective understanding of reality are circumvented, which is a very convenient way of approaching color. If we can't formulate it in mathematical formulas, we'll go around it and try to quantify it into measurable units and in terms other than the way we actually experience and perceive it. Rather than build a theory based on the immediate sense data, paradoxically, scientific approach inadvertently subverts the immediate experience of color, or the immediate appearance of color, by going behind it and explaining it in terms of a hidden mechanism, supposed to be more real than what is observed. This abstract representation of the phenomenon is held up as a mirror to nature. But the actual experience of human beings is with qualities and not with quantities. People don't immediately experience numbers and mathematical formulas. The latter are abstracted from the immediately experienced sensory qualities. Now, so rather than explain color as it appears to us, it is converted into measurable units and mathematical formulas. Is this explaining color or explaining it away? I'm not offering here a rejection of scientific approach by any means, but what I'm offering here is, from a Sufi perspective at least, a critique of its limitations. And I have a very interesting quote here from a German philosopher in his Schelling, who makes the following very important observation, which actually articulates the challenges of coming to terms with color that I'm trying to express here. And I quote, "First and above all, an explanation must do justice to the thing that is to be explained. It must not devalue it, interpret it away, belittle it, or garble it in order to make it easier to understand. The question is not at what view of the phenomenon must we arrive in order to explain it in accordance with one or another philosophy, but precisely the reverse. What philosophy is requisite if we are to live up to the subject, be on level with it? The question is not how the phenomenon must be turned, twisted, narrowed, crippled, so as to be explicable at all costs, upon principles that we have once and for all resolved not to go beyond. The question is to what point must we enlarge our thought so that it shall be in proportion to the phenomenon itself." Coban's work on color can be seen as an attempt to answer this question. To what point must we enlarge our thought, in this case in relation to color, so that it shall be in proportion to the phenomenon? Coban was very highly critical of approaches that turned, twisted, narrowed, and crippled the phenomenon so as to be explicable at all costs. And so everything hinges on how we see and approach the phenomenon itself, which is why I'm focusing on it so much here. The act of perception is not neutral. One does not passively receive sense data from the world. The act of perception is constitutive of what we receive of the world. In fact, the Arabic word for to perceive, adraka, suggests as much. It means to reach out, to reach. So in the widest possible sense, then, perception belongs to ethics, insofar as what one sees of the world depends on how one approaches it. An approach to the phenomenon that twists, turns, and narrows and cripples it to make it explicable at all costs does violence to the phenomenon itself. Is it possible to let the phenomenon speak for itself, without imposing it into preconceived categories? If so, what does such an approach look like? To this end, Coban adopted the method of phenomenology. And I don't want to get into the history of the tradition of phenomenology in the 20th century thought, but what I want to take away from this particular approach, especially for Coban, was the notion of the saving of appearance, the original Greek implications of phenomenology. It is the saving of the appearance of what shows itself forth. And the reason why Coban invoked phenomenology, because he found it a very convenient 20th century intellectual tool that goes back to the Greeks to articulate and explain how, and we shall see later how this is possible, how the Sufi approach or the mystical approach to phenomenon tries to save the very mode in which things appear to us, the very mode in which we see them and perceive them, rather than go around the phenomenon to explain it in mathematical quantified formulas, which is fine, not at the expense of the immediate way in which we perceive things and experience them. And so Coban defined phenomenology as a method which attempts to save the phenomenon by ultimately unveiling that which is hidden and concealed beneath the appearance. In this way, the method of phenomenology enlarges our thought in order to comprehend the phenomenon, rather than force the phenomenon into preconceived theoretical categories. Now, the phenomenon here corresponds to what in Islam Coban found the notion of the zahir, the apparent or the external. That which shows itself forth through the phenomenon, or the zahir, is ultimately called the batin. So the zahir is that which appears to us in the phenomenal reality of the world, but behind the phenomenal reality of the world, and I'll explain what I mean by behind in a minute, is the concealed dimension of that which is appearing. According to Islamic cosmology, where God is al-zahir and al-batin, there is a dignity and ontological value to the very appearance of things. The things of the world are understood as symbols, ayat, or ciphers of the divine, where a world of appearances and multiplicity that ultimately, when properly conceived and perceived, leads ultimately to the realization of the unity of God. This is why Coban found the profound philosophical and phenomenological meditations on the cosmos by the mystics of Islam so illuminating. In the writings of the Sufis, Coban found the lineaments of an approach to phenomenon that possessed such a rigorous fidelity to the appearance of things that he translated phenomenology in terms of the Islamic practice of kashf al-mahjub, or literally the unveiling or revealing of that which is hidden, that which is concealed beneath the appearance. Now, there are other Islamic practices which he dwelled on. I can't get into detailed, but I want to mention here ta'wil, from the Arabic awwala, which means the process of tracing something back to its origin, and ta'bir, literally the crossing over from the zahir to the batin. And both these terms, including kashf al-mahjub, suggest a movement, an appreciation of the very appearance of things, but then a movement into their depths. It must be understood, though, that the hidden dimension of the appearance of things is not the behind the phenomenon as something other. It's not circumventing the appearance of things and explaining it in terms of something else. It's entering into the very depth of the phenomenon through its appearance, the way it presents itself to our senses. Although the zahir conceals the batin, there is no intrinsic distinction between internal reality and external appearance. Rather, the zahir is the form in which the batin appears. The phenomenal manifestation is the place or the epiphany of the hidden reality, but it is never exhausted by it. Therefore, the zahir and the batin do not stand against each other, but are two faces of the same reality. And this goes against the notion, the general notion that Sufism denigrates the appearance of things and always suggests the movement to the batin. This is true, but not at the expense of the appearance of things. There's a dignity to the appearance of things which one cannot deny, or no Sufi can deny, because of the Quranic verse where God describes himself as al-zahir and al-batin. Color then, in this instance, from this perspective, is not turned, twisted, narrowed, and crippled, but saved as an intrinsic and primary quality of the world. But color in its mode of appearing and in the mode in which we experience it. It is an essential dimension to the phenomenon in which that which is hidden behind the appearance is making itself visible. The phenomenology of colors then, or the kashf al-mahjub, found in the spiritual meditations of the Sufis, then, is based on the immediate data of sense perception, the madahir, or the perceivable qualities, and thus yields a very different theory of colors than from the scientific. Not necessarily contradictory, but one that accounts for the qualities and primary experience of colors. Najmuddin Kubra, one of the great mystics and Sufis that Qurban worked on, provides a very interesting meditation on the greenness of plants. He says, the effect of gazing at greenery is such that one senses a racing of the heart, an expansion of the breast, a pleasing sensation in the soul, a sweet taste for the spirit, and a refreshing sensation for the inner eye. And of course, he takes his cue from the prophetic hadith, where the Prophet ﷺ says that, the tradition that says that he enjoyed gazing at greenery. Now, paradoxically then, the Sufis seem to possess a greater fidelity to the sensual appearance of things than most scientists do. It's a very interesting paradox. Ibn Arabi articulated this very well when he said, the senses never err, or the senses are never mistaken. It is the judging faculty that makes the mistakes. And interestingly enough, Goethe, many centuries later, said something very similar, to the effect that the senses do not deceive, it's the judging faculty that deceives. There's such a trust of the senses and the way in which it receives the world and perceives the world. It is the judging faculty, it is that faculty which interprets, as it were, or imposes abstract categories onto the immediate perception of things. That is where for Qurban, the error comes from. Now, so far we have been speaking about phenomenon of the visible world. However, Islamic cosmology inspired by the Quran speaks of two worlds, the seen and the unseen, or the physical world, alam al-shahada, and the spiritual or invisible world, alam al-ghayb. Such a vision of reality provides a very rich symbolic understanding of existence. The visible or seen world is described as the outer world, or the zahir, while the invisible or the unseen world is described as the inward, or the batin. According to Ghazali, for example, everything in the visible world is a symbol or mathal, similitude, of something in the invisible or unseen worlds. And the unseen worlds rise above the physical world and form a hierarchy. Now, this presents us with a very important question in relation to color. For a cosmology that posits a hierarchy of worlds, is color merely a quality of the physical world around us, or is it a quality of phenomena that extend into the suprasensory worlds, the other worlds of alam? Is it a quality of just physical objects, or is it a quality of existent things? Is it possible to ascend from the colors of this world without there being their homologues or correspondent in the other worlds? Now, several Quranic verses and hadiths are adduced to testify to the fact that colors are objectively real and they exist at all levels of existence. The Quran describes the colors of the garments of the inhabitants of heaven, the colors of the different rivers, the gems of the inhabitants of heaven, the colors of the faces on the Day of Judgment. In the hadith literature, we find traditions related to the lights of the pillars of the throne, which are usually identified as red, white, yellow, and green. The white dome with 1,000 gates of red gold, seen by the Prophet ﷺ in his nocturnal journey, al-Mi'raj. The colors of the veils that were lifted during his Mi'raj. So the meditations of the Islamic mystics on these verses and traditions are well articulated by the 19th century figure Kirmani, who Qurban worked on in terms of colors, when he says that the phenomenon of color is not limited to our sensible world. One cannot account for these colors in the invisible world unless one postulates, as Kirmani does, that every entity in existence, whether it is one of the bodies manifest in this world or the other world, possesses a color. To be sure, though, this color is more luminous and dazzling the closer we get to, or the closer we approach God. As the Quran says, God is the light of the heavens, of the earth. So if the color belongs to this world, it is opaque. The most dazzling color in this world is still opaque compared to the dazzling colors of the invisible realms. Now, it is very important here to keep in mind this multi-layered cosmology of the world, because without a multi-layered cosmology, the very process of plunging into the very depth of the appearance of things, into their batin, into their hidden depths, would not be possible. Now, Koban, the second theme I want to dwell on is a very important one that Koban talks about again and again, which is what he calls the Mundus Imaginaris, or the intermediary world of the soul. We're very used to, since Descartes, of talking about the physical world, the world of matter, and the world of mind, or the world of spirit. We have a two-tiered cosmology. Everything that's not physical must be spiritual. Everything spiritual, by definition, is abstract or devoid of body. But the Islamic cosmology posited a world in between sense perception, in between the world of the body and the world of intellect, and as the world of the soul. And the function of this world of the soul is very important, without which understanding the entire religious facts and mystical tradition is impossible. The alam al-mithal, or the intermediary world of the soul, is an ontological level of existence that exists on its own terms. It's not fantasy world, it's not what we call today imagination. We often relegate the experience of poets to just fantasy or imagination. We often relegate the experience of dreams to some kind of psychic realm. This is a real world, an ontological world, and our physical world is derived from these higher worlds. So it has an ontological dignity of its own. It stands alone. The function of this world is to mediate between the sensory world and the intelligible world. When a mystic has a dream of encountering visionary perceptions or lights or figures, to the practice of dhikr, to the practice of meditation, to the practice of spiritual exercises, the mystic is able to develop what is often referred to in the Islamic tradition as the capacity of the heart, the faculty of the heart, which has a powerful imaginative faculty. And what it does is it transmutes and offers bodily form to spiritual reality that don't have, by definition, any body. And it spiritualizes bodies, and it allows and permits the encounter in this intermediary world between sensible realities and spiritual realities. And without this higher, hierarchy of intellectual worlds, a hierarchy of spiritual worlds, one above the other, one cannot account for a lot of the spiritual experiences. One can either call them hallucinations or fantasies. But having postulated the existence of this intermediary world, one revolutionizes our very understanding of what it means to imagine and marginalize. The image here, paradoxically, the Islamic tradition, although it supposedly, it's in religious, especially particularly religious art, banned the portrayal of divinity in art, and it had quite a hesitant attitude towards any images. It paradoxically valorizes images of the imagination. I'm not going to dwell too long on this notion of the imagination because I'm aware I'm running out of time. The third theme I want to discuss here is the notion of light and darkness. And light has been considered a symbol of the divine since times immemorial. In the Islamic tradition, the notion of light takes its primary inspiration from the Quran, where God describes himself as the light of the heavens and the earth. So many mystical commentaries have dwelt over the meanings of this light verse. Ghazali offers a very interesting categorization of light in this particular verse. He says there are three possible meanings of light, generally speaking. There's physical light, which is what we take account of in our daily experiences. The physical light, which is visible to visual perception. The second meaning of light suggests the faculty of the eye, which sees, or the intellect. And the third meaning of light, which is more specific, is the absolute light, or the first light, because it is the light that does not borrow its luminosity from something else, but bestows it upon others. This light is the light of God. And herein is the full meaning of the verse, God is the light of the heavens and the earth. God is light, and all other light is borrowed from his light. God's light is so luminous and so pure that no darkness mixes with it. and he is therefore veiled from creation by the very intensity and luminosity of his own light. There's a hadith where God, the tradition says that God is veiled by 70,000 veils of darkness and light. Now, this more nuanced understanding of light enables us to understand how we can speak of God as being light, how the angels are made of light, how spirits are light, how the prophets are described as lights, how the heart is light, how the intellect, the faith, the sun, the eye, and ordinary light are instances of this particular light of God. But what of darkness? In the Quran, we read, He ordained the darkness and the light. In Islamic cosmology, light is considered, the pure light is considered the light of God. Darkness is considered Adam, non-existence. Everything in between is considered a mixture of light and darkness. And a mixture of light and darkness in Islamic cosmology is what produces colors. So by definition, every existent entity other than God has to possess a color because it's a mixture of light and darkness. It's not pure light because only God is pure light, but it's not darkness either, pure darkness, otherwise it would not exist. This is one account of the origins of light. The second is, as we said earlier, the throne of God itself is from where it possesses light. The pillars have lights, different colors, and so the colors of this world are derived from the colors of the lights of the throne. I want to read out a very interesting quote by Suhrawardi, one of the great mystics that Qurban worked on. He says, "The essence of the first absolute light, or God, gives constant illumination, whereby it is manifested and brings all things into existence, giving life to them by its own rays. Everything in the world is derived from the light of his essence, and all beauty and perfection of the gift of his bounty. And to attain fully to this illumination is salvation." Now, there are crucial number of implications for this notion of light and darkness. The first is, all of existence itself is identified as light. God is the pure light, non-existence is pure darkness, everything in between existence is considered an opaque or dimmed light. With different levels of intensity, the closer one gets to God. The closer one gets to God in this hierarchy of light, the purer the light is, the closer one gets to the density of matter, the darker or more opaque objects are. Now, the ontological status of every existent entity in the universe is determined by the degree of its luminosity. Every object in the world has a degree of luminosity. Human beings, objects, physical objects. But the higher one is on the hierarchy of worlds, the more intense the light is. So everything is defined by its intensity of light, or otherwise by its light density or its darkness density. This has profound implications for our understanding of color later. The second implication is that the perception of light and darkness in the Sufi experience is not a metaphoric expression. One often says, one has a profound spiritual experience, and some commentators might suggest that the Sufi articulates in the language of metaphor or physical experience something that's not physical. But in fact, it's the reverse. Because existence itself is identified as a mixture of light and darkness, what the Sufi actually experiences as he rises out of this world is the very experience of light and darkness of his own self. And there's a very interesting quote here from Toshihiko Isutsu, where he says, "The traveler experiences and perceives the state from which he aspires to free himself as shadow and darkness, as powers which attract him downward. He perceives light and all the signs and premonitions heralding his liberation, and all the apparitions that attract him upwards as light." Now, I want to rehash very quickly. We have in Qurban, a phenomenology of colors, the ethics of approach to the phenomenon of color, the fact that everything in existence possesses a color, and that there exists an intermediary world of the soul between sense perception and the intellect, in which the drama of the soul, the drama of the initiate, the drama of the traveler returning back to God is played out. And in Najmuddin Kubra, he says that when an initiate begins his journey out of this world, he experiences his creaturely existence. It's not yet his consciousness, but his most basic creaturely existence of matter. And he sees it dramatized before his very eyes, the inner eye of the heart, in the following manner. Kubra says that it first appears as a complete darkness. When it begins to be purified, you will see it take before your very eyes the appearance of a black cloud. In another instance, he says, as for the lower self, at its first appearance, its color is deep blue. It seems to be like an upsurge, like that of water from a spring. If the soul is the seat of the devil, it takes on the twofold upsurge of a darkness and a fire. If this fire is dim, it denotes in the mystic a state of fatigue and affliction, following the battle with the lower ego. Blue is the color of this lower ego. Yellow indicates as lessening of activity. So when one traverses the elemental nature, one perceives various lights, green, red, yellow, and blue. To express and explain the appearance of these colors, the Sufis speak of this concept called talween. Talween, the word talween in Arabic comes from the word lawn, which is color. The talween is the coloring of one's spiritual states. Now, having just explained earlier that every existent in the universe is a form of light, and the talween concept then suggests that the spiritual states one experiences inwardly are profound existential experiences that one goes through. In language contemporary psychology, one often thinks that if one experiences something internally, it's like a fleeting concept or idea or abstract thing that passes through the mind. But the notion of talween here does not suggest that. It suggests what we were talking about earlier. The ontological status of every entity, every being in existence, is determined by its intensity of light. The fluctuations in one's experiences or one's intensity of light is experienced as different colors. And this is what it meant by talween. So let us summarize very quickly the colored lights we have seen so far in Najmuddin Kubra. At the level of creaturely existence, we have a blackness, while the devil assumes a reddish appearance. On the lower level of the soul, we have the nafs al-ammara, or the lower self, which at one end is submerged in creaturely existence, and therefore appears in the form of a black circle or black cloud, while at the other end, slightly above it, it assumes a dark blue color on the threshold of consciousness. On the intermediary level of the soul, we have the nafs al-lawama, or self-consciousness, which appears as a slightly glowing orange-like light. At the highest level of the soul, or what the Quran calls the nafs al-mutma'inna, it appears as green, emerald in splendor. And what is the meaning of these colors? These colored lights must be interpreted, Qur'an reminds us, as signs revealing the mystic state of degree and spiritual progress. As Kubra reminds us, you experience inwardly in yourself what you visualize with your inner sight. And reciprocally, you visualize with your inner sight precisely what you experience in yourself. The interpretation of these lights and their meaning is a very precise science. One often thinks that the mystical experience is quite an arbitrary, a very subjective one. It's subjective in terms of how one experiences it, but not subjective in terms of how one can understand it. And therefore, it is subject to a very rigorous balance. In fact, so rigorous is it that one often compares it to the rigor, empirical rigor of a scientific observation, which is why the distinction between a scientific approach to color and a qualitative approach to color seems obsolete when understanding how the Sufis approach. There is a rigorous fidelity to the empirical experience of color. It is vital that real visions are often distinguished from psychic hallucinations, and criteria are offered for distinguishing between them. For example, the green color of plants we quoted earlier, and I'll quote it again, the sign of their life and their vitality. The effect of gazing at such greenery. So when one sees green plants, often it's a sign of vitality and life in greenery. Now, the effect of gazing at such greenery is such that one senses a racing of heart, an expansion of the breast, a pleasing sensation in the soul, a sweet taste for the spirit, a refreshing sensation for the inner eye. And these are the qualities of life itself. Perceived internally, then, the color green is the sign of the life of the heart, if, according to Kubra, it evinces the same response or the same corresponding state which one perceives in the physical greenery. Yellow in greenery is an indication of the weakness of the plant due to a sickness that has afflicted it. As an internal color of the soul, yellow indicates a lessening of activity, in the same way that yellow in a growing plant indicates a lessening and a weakening of activity. In the soul, it suggests the weakening of the activity of the soul. Now, one may say, well, does all yellow in the mystical experience mean the same thing? Well, it doesn't. It depends on the state of growth of the traveler, because the yellow of a flower is considered very different from the yellow of a withering plant, and they mean very different things. The yellow of a flower stands more in the category of the gold mineral or the sun, which symbolizes a higher state of achievement than the yellow of the withering greenery of a plant. And like a psychotherapist, the Sufi master must be well versed in this art and very familiar with the stage of progress of the spiritual initiate to be able to explain and articulate these nuances. Now, when the traveler has reached the divine light, the variability or coloring of his soul diminishes and is replaced by a colorless constancy called tamkeen. Tamkeen can be translated as rest or stability or fixity, and conveys the sense of a constancy of the spiritual states. Tamkeen is the state where there's no more any coloring and that one attains to a colorless tincturing. Paradoxically, this is called, in the Quran, it's called sibra, in reference to the Quranic verse, we take our color from God, and who is better than God at coloring? It should be noted that the color bestowed by God's coloring is colorless, which explains why there is no coloring after it. It is all colors and no color. Color from God, and I quote here Rusbihan, color from God is the colorless color. Whoever becomes purified of the coloring of color becomes colored by God. It is in fact pure light. This coloring is none other than light of being itself. One sheds the darkness of one's matter in real terms and attains to the purity of light. It is in fact pure light. This coloring is none other than the light of being itself, which explains its supreme beauty. So, going back to the original question, what is color? Well, what answer to the question, what is color, at least in the Sufi tradition, requires a phenomenology of color which will unveil to us at every level, both the sensible, we have to take account of the sensible and the suprasensible. The mode of reality of colors at all levels, which will account for also their existence and manifestation. Phenomenology, or Kashf al-Mahjub, then attempts to find the wholeness and plenitude of the phenomenon of color in the color itself as it appears, rather than reduce it to a hidden mechanism. But the color is not merely that which is visible or appears on the physical plane of existence. The phenomenon of color found in the spiritual traditions is to be encountered where they take place and at all possible levels. The world of the soul, for example, as we were discussing earlier. It is a matter of entering into the phenomenon itself, the phenomenon of color, and making it visible in its full ontological depth and plenitude. The full meaning of the phenomenon of color unfolds within the soul through the act of perception. The act of perception no longer is something passive where we receive the data, but the soul itself participates in the actual unveiling of the depths and the ontological plenitude of the appearance of color, or the phenomenon. In this sense, true sense perception of phenomena, aesthetics, moves away from the physical appearance by things by plunging into their very depths to reveal their archetypal essences, their asl or their roots in the spiritual world. And this brings the perceptual act to fulfillment. The plenitude of the symbol, its layers of meaning, is thus unveiled and unraveled as a drama of the soul. Without the intermediary space of the imagination, alam al-mithal, or the imaginal world, and its corresponding organ of perception, which is the heart, all religious truth and spiritual realities will seem meaningless. All religious phenomena lose their ontological grounding and their meaning in the absence of this imagination and its organ of perception. Symbolic images, instead of being invested with a symbolic function, are reduced to the level of sensory perception. And it's paradoxical that the scientific approach or many contemporary approaches that would reduce the phenomenon to hidden mechanisms or abstract categories, iconoclastic in a double sense. In one sense, by denying the invisible reality behind phenomenon, they're reducing the physical appearance of things to idols rather than being icons. And in the second movement, they reduce the phenomenon as it appears to something hidden behind it, as a hidden mechanism. I'll stop here because I think I've reached the limit of my paper. Do I have time for questions? Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay, so yes, thank you. We have about 5 minutes, I think, for if there are any questions. Bernard, down here. Thank you, Samir. That was excellent.
Thank you.
Thanks
Put us
very
on
much
another plane, shall we say.
for this clear exposition of many of the important points of Sufi symbolism. You began your presentation by castigating art historians for not paying enough attention to Henri Corbin and Sufi symbolism. It would be an enormous help if an expert like you could analyze some actual works of art rather than just talking about them in the abstract. You talked, for instance, about the realm of the imagination and valorized this. You talked about its ontological existence, but it's very hard for art historians who deal with actual objects to see how this could be relevant to their analysis. It's perhaps rather unfortunate as well that you had one illustration up on the screen the whole time, which you didn't analyze for us.
I stand responsible. I'll stand up there. We just thought it would be nicer to have something to look at rather than nothing to look at. So we supplied that image and told him specifically that he did not have to address it.
Okay. Then
So I take the blame fully for that
No,
one.
that's fine. I'd like to address the
It's
question.
just as well you didn't, because you unfortunately picked one in which the greens, of which Najmuddin and Najmuddin Kubra play so wonderfully, had become transformed magically into blues in the illustration. It had lost all its original color values. Thank you.
Thank you. There are a number of reasons why I didn't get into analysis of art objects. First of all, from my point of view, I think it's a bit too early at this state of scholarship yet to make comments on the influence of Sufism and the mystical tradition on actual art objects. The connections do exist to certain art objects, of course. Anyone who's ever been into a tekke or a zawiya where Sufis meditate and pray, the use of colors and the portrayal of turbans and Sufi masters for meditation is no coincidence. And from an art historical perspective, they're worthy of study. But I avoided that question because I wanted to explore more the question of, for want of a better term, the medieval Islamic aesthetic sensibility. And of course, there isn't a single sensibility, there are several. And by focusing on Ibn Arabi, well, I'm doing my PhD on Ibn Arabi, so I'm focusing on Ibn Arabi really. But by focusing on a number of critical authors in the Sufi tradition and other figures working on aesthetics and beauty in other figures, I think we can get a clearer idea. Otherwise, to the best of my knowledge, I'm not an art historian myself, so I can't really comment on any of the images. But I think it's very difficult terrain to enter into. And working on Sufism myself, that's all I can actually speak about.
Do we have another? Yes, over here.
Yeah, I just wanted to see if it is possible to put your very compelling argument for saving the phenomenon through the phenomena in general, through Sufi ontology, with the very compelling argument of the previous paper about consciousness and awareness at the craft level of neurobiological, of what neurobiology describes as the what system and the where system and so on. So I guess I'm just trying to put those two together because I think there is a connection, and maybe this also goes some way towards answering Professor O'Kane's observation. So what would you say about these craftsmen who are patterning and shaping and coloring the Alhambra? Are they Sufis? Or if that's impossible to say, what would the Sufi ontology say about them? Is it possible? Is this a way to combine the two?
To be honest with you, I don't know. I don't.
Can I just step
Yes,
in here?
absolutely.
Only because you mentioned Suhrawardi as one of the great Sufis, and we know that one of the greatest calligraphers of 14th century Iran was one of the main, was the grandson, great-grandson of the Suhrawardi you were talking about, but also a Sufi and leader of the Sufi tariqa in Baghdad. So clearly some artists, and very famous ones, were Sufis.
Yeah, well, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. They were Sufis, but in terms of commenting on how they actually practiced, or how Sufism comes to bear on the actual art, I don't think, well, maybe you can back me up on this, but I don't think at this stage we can actually say, definitive. And I don't think we need to at this point. I think we focus so much energy on trying to come up with all possible meanings of what the Alhambra is and other objects, whereas medieval Islamic aesthetic sensibilities in various literary sources are sitting, lingering around without any scholarly attention. I think, as a scholar, I think solid hard facts need to be focused on.
I think at this point, we've had enough of the inner spiritual life, and we need to attend to the outer physical life. And our stomachs, I heard a certain rumbling in some stomachs around me. So I think it's time now to go for a coffee break. We will reconvene in 45 minutes at 11:30. And just, I think, another hand for both of our speakers this morning who've given us a wonderful introduction to this field.